Hey, Andra. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get us started because we don't have a lot of time. We only have an hour, but we're really excited. Just want to welcome everyone to the joint webinar of the California Community College Women's Caucus today. And Alex, if you could advance the slide. And also the California Community College LGBTQ plus caucus. And we're very proud of our logo. So I want to make sure that that is on the screen. Next slide. For those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Erica Androgenis. I'm Superintendent President from Pasadena City College, and really excited to be here. I sort of bridge the gap between both caucuses. I was one of the first two co-chairs of the Women's Caucus, along with Nan Gomez-Heisberg. And I was a founding member of the LGBTQ caucus, former co-chair and now treasurer of that august group of folks. And so it's my pleasure to be here. And as I'll talk about in a minute, I was also part of this leadership book. In fact, if you want to go to the next slide, Alex. That's right, because what are we doing here today? We are really fortunate to have 4 authors from the LGBTQ leadership in higher education, including the editor who made this all happen, Dr. Ray Crossman. And so I'm going to do a quick introduction for each person, and then I'm going to turn it over and you're going to hear from all of us, and I'll make a couple of comments first, and then there'll be some time for questions and answers. So next slide. So the first person who's going to talk to us is the guy who made it happen, Dr. Ray Crossman, and he's president of Adler College, and he's a social justice activist, educator, and psychologist who, you gotta love it, is the longest serving LGBTQ university president in North America. He was appointed in 2003, and we are so excited to be working with him and appreciate his length of service. Yes, it can happen. Next slide, please. And then we also have Dr. Karen Whitney with us, who is currently an advisor, a senior consultant with the American Association of Schools and Colleges University. I think I said that wrong, consulting, and a content expert for Academic Impressions, which I think a lot of us know about, as well as a member of the registry. She was interim chancellor. She keeps failing retirement people. Interim chancellor of the University of Illinois at Springfield and interim chancellor of the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. Can you say politics, politics, politics? And is president emeritus of Clarion University, also in Pennsylvania. Next slide. And then, of course, we have our very own Dr. Regina Stanbeck Stroud, who really in California needs no introduction. Rock star. She's an anti-racist activist, committed practitioner, facilitating racial and equity literacy development. She served as the chancellor of Peralta Community College District, president and vice president of instruction at Skyline College. She also proudly served on President Barack Obama's his advisory council on financial capability for young Americans. And so happy that my fellow Californian was able to participate in this. And then finally, next slide. We have Dr. Daniel Lopez, who is currently president of Harold Washington College. He is an immigrant, non-native speaker, first-generation college student, and former undocumented student. And certainly that is who we work so hard to work with here in our state. So it's really exciting to have Daniel's perspective. He's currently president of Harold Washington College, which is one of the city colleges of Chicago. So with that, we'll take the PowerPoint down and I'll start speaking for a minute. So this book, which Ray Crossman is going to talk to us about, and his work on it and putting us together, I'm not going to talk about that. I was fortunate to be part of writing 3 of the articles, and one of them was about LGBTQ leadership. And one of the things I talked about in that particular article, I also wrote on feminism as well as building an inclusive campus. One of the things I talked about is that there is this, I don't want to say tension, but there is a difference in perspective because some of us, there are lots of LGBTQ presidents, chancellors, leaders, trustees out there. Some of us are gay presidents or gay leaders, and some of us are leaders who happen to be gay. And how we approach our world, how we approach our identities is very much about that. And it was interesting. I had never really thought about that until I went to my first meeting of the national LGBTQ presidents in higher education. This was back in 2016. And I was struck just listening to the stories of the folks around the room. And, you know, looking around the room, it's like, oh, that he really identifies as a gay president. And then another person, it's like, oh, that person is a president who just happens to be gay. And I think the reason I bring it up is that intersectionality is so much a part of our world, but I don't think we talk enough about what that means. And that's one of the reasons that I so appreciate this book, which I know everybody on this webinar has totally purchased and has read cover to cover. So now is your time to see the rock stars who made it all happen. So, you know, this was near and dear to my heart. And it's just, we all have very different ways of approaching it. And again, some of us are presidents who happen to be gay, and some of us are gay presidents. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to the guy who started it all, Dr. Ray Crossman, who's going to talk to us about the book and some other stuff. So with that, Ray.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you for starting this, right? So really appreciate the forum and coming together with some of my favorite people who were also authors in this a collection of essays, and really happy that these organizations have made time to have this conversation, which I think is very important to be had right now, because I think one of the, you know, going beyond higher ed, one of the most important things I think for the planet right now is to figure out how to make leadership more diverse and more reflective of who needs to be led. It is the central challenge for meeting human rights or making things happen that are going to be equitable right now. And so this is an important conversation to be had in higher ed and in other sectors. So, Erica, I appreciate the introduction, but I'm not necessarily the guy who made it happen, because I'll tell you, the guy who made it happen was Greg Britton at Johns Hopkins University Press. Said, we need a book in this area. And he called me. And you know, he's the lead at Johns Hopkins University Press. There hasn't been a book written about queer leadership in higher ed. After some conversation about this, we got to the place where we decided the first book in this area needs to be multiple voices. It needs to be a chorus. It needs to reflect the diversity that we're talking about. Let subsequent books be single author books. And I know a number of us are working on follow-up projects stimulated by our essays in this book. I know I am. But the first book needed to be a collection and to hear from multiple perspectives about this issue, about, you know, why queer leadership matters. You know, I didn't quite parse it through. I parsed it differently in the original question that the authors were asked to speak to, which is like, is being queer a superpower when you're a leader? Or is it just another, you know, is it part of our intersectional identity that's important that we bring to our leadership? Or is it just another characteristic of a, you know, accomplished leader? You know, if you're able to look at the essays within the book, everybody has a distinct answer and a distinctly different answer. As you'll hear from Erica, I'll talk a little bit. And, for Daniel, Karen, and Regina speaking as well. Just a few words about the construction of the book. So when you look at the 100 or so LGBTQ presidents, there aren't any T's yet that we know of. It's the same as the US college presidency. It's mostly white men, right? So we tried to work against that in putting together the voices for this book. There are 15 chancellors and presidents. 8 of them are women. A quarter are BIPOC authors. Most were retired. I think that's who we could get to write. Retired or in an encore position. Following an initial presidency. Most are baby boomer. There's a few from the generation before, one from the generation after, or the other way around. One from prior, a couple afterwards, a couple Gen Xers. And that means that basically, I think that what we're speaking to is not necessarily completely relevant for current leaders who are LGBTQ, because what we're doing, I think, is we're archiving a particular moment in leadership, and hopefully, in a rearview mirror, a book like this won't be necessary to support the changes that need to happen in leadership. But right now, you got a bunch of old people writing about what they think leadership means. Yeah, that's a little bit about how we set up the book. Each topic within the book, whether or not you're talking about interviewing for a presidency or self-care or mentorship, heterosexism, homophobia, leading inclusion on the campuses. These are the topics of the book. Each of the topics we decided to arrange in a panel. So there's 3 essays that have been coordinated for each of those topics. And we tried to coordinate our voices so that we had different things to say about each of those topics. So that's probably enough of a setup about the structure of the book, other than saying, it was indeed a collaboration. I mean, we're a group of dear friends and colleagues, many of whom were involved in setting up the first organization for LGBTQ presidents. I think each of us felt very privileged to be able to have a place to document what we think is important about leadership. So I'll say just a couple words about my perspective. For me, I think being gay is a superpower. That's what I think. And it's not that I think that I could or should leap tall buildings in a single bound. Just the opposite, actually. It means that because I'm queer, I'm more in touch with my humanity as a leader. And I've thought about and written about, some characteristics that I think come from this. One, I'm not the first to write about this, a sense of queer intuition, meaning the experience of growing up gay, where you're always scanning for danger and for getting bullied, leads to you looking around corners, wondering about alternative solutions, and realizing that normal solutions won't necessarily work for you. So that means, for me as a leader, if there's a minority report, I want to read it. If there's an out-of-the-box idea, I want to hear about that. So I think that's very much, that characteristic of my leadership follows from me being queer. Second, I will say that me always reaching for the fabulous in my leadership comes from being queer. So that's a big part of queer culture. Oscar Wilde, just the idea that we're going to be spectacular flowers no matter what food we get or not in the garden. And that's led to me in my leadership, I work hard to make it more political, more transgressive. I try to be more courageous in my leadership. I think that follows from my experience of growing up gay. And lastly, my willingness to be a mess in front of other people, I think comes from a large part from being gay. And what I mean by that is, like, as a gay person, you are always just like trying to work it out in the straight world. And, that leads to a certain vulnerability, that leads to, things that usually aren't rewarded within the presidency, right? Authenticity is not rewarded in these jobs most often. But I learned very early in my presidency that if I kept it real and if I tried to talk about my own process, I was better in my leadership. And I think that comes from being gay as well. So those are a few things that I think about when I think about why queer leadership matters. We could talk more about intersectionality too around HIV. That's something that I've been talking a lot about, but maybe in the questions. But with that, I will pass. Erica, who follows me?
It is Karen who follows you.
Thanks, Erica. Here you go, Karen.
Boy, I drew this short straw. Anytime following after Dr. Crossman's always a hard act to do. Thanks a bunch, Erica. But no, many thanks to Erica for bringing us together, and always eternal gratitude to Ray for being our leader on this. And you were very humble about, and kudos to Johns Hopkins and Greg Britton's leadership. But you're the one that sent me all those inspiring emails to finish my essays and things like that. So I want to, I promised Erica, what I'm going to do is a couple of things. I'm going to read a couple of passages from 2 of the essays I wrote and give you some takeaway points, because I know that some of you guys have the book and you may have it with you, and I'll reference the page. Others, it's still not too late to buy one, or gift one to somebody. So, because it was just a fabulous journey to work on this book, and I agree with Ray that for the first book of this kind, to have so many voices and the approach that we took, but Ray, I will be the first one to buy the Ray Crossman Volume 1. So I'm there with you. So when it comes out, but I am thankful for all the voices. Just to let you know, I'm going to talk about 2 essays. One, Chapter 7, Leading in a Homophobic World. And somehow that should be a jingle or a song in my head. I don't know. Then the other one will be, I think, Chapter 10 about spouses and partners. Or the subtitle on that is How to Be a Leader and Still, Keep Your Spouse. So, okay. So that's how I'm going to go. That's how I've promised. And I'm going to do this in about 8 minutes or less. So let's see how this works. Okay. So let me start off by reading, because it was fun last night to reread this. It'd been a little while. So leading in a homophobic world, I'm going to read a couple lines on the first paragraph and then the last. And then I'm going to give you the key points. So this is me. Where and when we grow up and begin our careers often shapes us throughout our lives. I grew up and went to college in Houston, Texas. I came of age during the 1970s. I graduated from high school in 1978 and attended the local university that fall. It was a time when you could work your way through college, attend school full-time, and still have a rich and busy social life. My high school and college years were bracketed by carefree disco nights. That's how old I am. And the repressive so-called moral majority. It was a time that was both exciting and terrifying for a woman in her 20s coming out as a lesbian. It was both horribly isolating and incredibly empowering. These are moments and places that continue to influence me today as an educator, administrator, and leader. That's my paragraph. What I have to say on the heels of Dr. Crossman's comments, for those of you who are at different decades or stages of your career, I'd love to know, does this resonate at all? Does the kind of juxtaposition of excitement and terror and going from your 20s into your 30s and starting your career, where does that go? So just to bookend it, and then I'll give you a couple takeaways. I end the essay by saying, because I do give you highlights. I'm not going to give you everything because I want you to read it, buy the book and read it, because I give you examples of what it was like to grow up in Texas and through all those decades. But I end by saying for almost 40 years, I've worked in higher education, including 20 years at the executive level. I've rarely talked about living and leading during an age of homophobia. Despite my personal and professional accomplishments, I have to ask myself, was I holding myself back because of the circumstances in which I came of age? To be honest, I don't really want to talk about being victimized or marginalized. I like to talk positively about confidence and courage and all those other things that inspire leaders to meet challenges. Only now at the late stage in my career have I considered the consequences of being an out lesbian. The answer, which I guess is obvious, is that coming of age in the 70s and beginning my career in the early 80s had homophobic consequences, and they inform my story, which thankfully is a story of success, earned through courage, confidence, and resilience. A takeaway for any leader and for LGBT leaders is to proudly be true to who you are, prepare for the worst, and expect the best. And so a couple of takeaways, because my colleagues know me these days, I'm really much into leadership development. I'm a certified coach. I consult. I'm really about my give back period now is helping each of you guys being here today and others to be successful. So a couple of takeaways is all of us have origin stories. Mine again was, in the 70s and 80s, and we have a context of when we were born and how we grew, the time and the context we grew up. I mean, my first year of college, Harvey Milk was assassinated. That informed my existence tremendously. Being on there in Houston, Texas. Of course, Texas is a gift that keeps giving, it seems like, throughout the decades. But being part of one of the early LGBTQ switchboards, and if you don't know what that is, look it up, because that's before the internet. Looking at the things that informed me into my leadership. And as always, I love Ray's comments on the queer intuition. There's a phrase that I'm thinking about quite a bit now and working with several clients on really delving into what I'm calling, I didn't call it, but post-traumatic growth. While we have stress, there can be growth. And how do we seize that? Because there are things that traumatize us to this day. So those are several takeaways on that chapter. Let me move on to the next one, if I could. Slightly different chapter, but I will tell you very important, and I'll be speaking on chapter, I think it's 10, page 140. I feel like I'm at church for those of you who want to follow. The fun fact I have to mention, or I'll get in trouble, is I co-wrote this essay with my spouse, who in her own right had a tremendous career as a faculty member, and that we had fun times when I was a college president at her college where she was faculty. And yes, she did keep me on my toes every single day for 7 years, and still to this day, and we've been together almost 30. So on that one, what I want to do is read a couple sentences at the beginning, and then I'll close in the comments. And I know we're presidents, but I'll ask, particularly when I talk to spouses and families, no matter where you are in your leadership, my hope is this will resonate, because it asks a fundamental question of how do you bring in your spouse or partner or family into your leadership? I mean, it's very pronounced at the presidential level, but it doesn't just begin there. I think what I see are patterns along the way. So I'm not just talking to those of you who are presidents or who want to be, this is anybody in leadership. College presidents, that's what I wrote, college presidents and their presidencies are often studied in order to understand their successes or failures. What is less often considered is that a spouse, partner, or other member of the president's family is also part of the presidency. The presidency is more than the person holding the title. It is, in fact, the community of internal and external stakeholders who support, connect, oversee, and are impacted by the president. The intentional or unintentional attitudes and actions of a spouse actually contribute to the success or failure of presidencies. If you don't believe me, Google president spouses from the Chronicle, and it seems like about every other year, there's a sensational story of a spouse doing something and the president or chancellor gets fired. It is really, it's a big deal what I'm talking about here. Now, in our case, in being queer, given the attention to presidents, it's even heightened when you're queer. And one of the comments that I make in another essay is, I think visually and externally, we're at our heightened queerness externally when you're with somebody else and you claim that person as your spouse or partner. Because I think for a lot of straight people, they want to try to forget we're queer. they want to kind of put it in the back of their mind. But in terms of representation, it's very pronounced when you say, this is my spouse or this is my partner in some way. It makes it real for whoever your audience that you're dealing with. So I think I'll end with, and then a couple of pointers. As more LGBT leaders become college presidents and bring their families to their presidencies, understanding, and I give a four-part model on becoming a president, understanding the stages of a presidency. I claim there's 4 stages, and understanding and proactively planning and preparing for the additional challenges as an LGBTQ presidential couple is priceless. So some may argue, well, why do I have an extra effort or tax I have to deal with? And I'm like, well, we are in predominantly, and Ray mentioned this, a majority of presidencies are still held by white men. It's very heteronormative. A lot of institutions you walk into, that culture and history is still very dominated and very patriarchal, and our very presence there is a shifting presence, which actually is a huge energy for me, but that is an extra tax. And if you're bringing somebody along, it does help to talk through. So a couple of takeaways, and then I'll hand this on to the next author, is always, I would suggest, unless you already know that's the opposite, if you love your spouse or partner more than a job, let's pretend you do, then act like it. Talk with them as you're aspiring or preparing or attending to, or even as you close out a leadership position, involve them. Talk with them strategically. Talk about, I have brought in and taken the word fit for myself actively. Where is the geography, type of institution, the role, 4,000 colleges and universities, the roles of leadership vastly are different. And I think bringing in the family in a proactive way, not just saying, oh, honey, I got a good job, is one way you keep the person that you bring into that relationship. So I strongly encourage you to act that they are more important and involve them in these stages actively. And there's lots of decisions and lots of ways to do it. I just am a real advocate, and we've written on this, it's in the book, and there's some other articles out there. So I'll go ahead and stop with that. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute. Back at you, Erica. Who's next?
Okay, great. Thank you, Karen. And I appreciate your perspectives, especially the, hey, honey, I got a great job. Maybe not. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Regina Stanback-Stroud. Take it away, Regina.
Well, thank you so much, Erica, and thank you to all of you. Hello to all of my California colleagues, trustees, as well as CEOs and other members from your colleges and districts. Really good to be with you here today, and really neat to be here with my co-authors as well. It is an honor and a privilege to have had the opportunity to be a part of this project. As I shared with the organizers earlier, I happen to be at an airport on a hot spot. So my fingers are crossed that I get to stay with you. But if you lose me, then Karen has promised to start to tell jokes. So we got you covered no matter what. And it's been my pleasure to have the opportunity to contribute to this book. And the area that I was asked to contribute was around the issue of coming out. And that actually was really interesting because from my perspective, I had lived this, what was defined by, my experience, a normal life, kind of but then it's normal as in the normality that comes from being Black in these United States. So growing up in the segregated South and going off to Howard University, which was known at that time as the Chocolate City because 98% of the population was Black. But from my young eyes, and experience, I landed in a racial mecca. I landed someplace where, for the first time in my life, I was racially comfortable virtually 24 hours a day. And so that normality comes from the ways in which I was raised. I was raised as a military child. I lived in a military town. We had fully defined gender roles that were reinforced by my mother and Miss Polly, who lived down the street, and Miss Olivia, who lived around the corner, that would tell me, Gina, don't laugh so loud. Young ladies just don't laugh that loud. And of course, I would be cackling at every single joke and laughing for a long time in a loud way. But they had relied on specific gender roles in order to survive through the civil rights work that they were doing. There were assigned and specific gender roles. So I don't have judgment about that. I didn't grow up with my, feminist perspective, telling the older people what they should be doing and how they should have responded or how they should have engaged. I went on to marry a military man and had a beautiful son with who is now a beautiful man in his own right. And the change from my mother's perspective was when we moved to California, and she had to use that as the explanation for why I might not be quite right. She lives in California would be her explanation, no matter if something seemed a little bit strange. And then I would say, after years of estrangement from my husband, who is still my friend to this day, I met a woman that I couldn't navigate, what these feelings were. It was unfamiliar to me. And I said to my friend, oh my God, I met this woman and I really like her. Kind of like, I feel nervous around her, kind of like when you see a cute guy that you like. And she said, well, maybe you like her like you like a guy. That was just impossible from my perspective. But all I knew was that I wanted her in my life. And so I did what any respectable academic would do. I went to the bookstore and I bought a lot of books on how to be a lesbian because I did not know this world. And so you'll see that from my perspective, it was like, as one author said, pouring the orange juice from one glass to another. It was so fluid. It wasn't that I came out any more than I came out when I married a man. I was just out and I was just being present. I was, it was a kind of a gift that others had given me to have the luxury to do that. So I'll read a little bit here from the book that might give you some idea. I met my wife when I was 40 years old, and I was an established professional woman with a few resources in education that gave me options. I lived in one of the more progressive states, and I didn't have to confront this negative, mean, vitriolic discourse that challenged my humanity on a daily basis. And yet I still needed to tell my siblings and my mother in North Carolina and my very religious grandmother, and my siblings were pretty easy. At no point did I worry that they wouldn't continue to love me and support me. My mother and I talked regularly, and sometimes it was about big things and sometimes small things, like, what are you cooking for dinner tonight? And one evening I shared that my husband and I were divorcing, and she was saddened, but very comforting. And then I told her that I was seeing a woman, and she got very quiet on the other end. And for many, seconds, it seemed like an eternity, but it was just a few seconds. She said, so that's not surprising. So what are you cooking for dinner tonight? And just like that, we resumed our rightful roles as mother and daughter. And she shifted, shifting that discussion to the question about dinner might have been her grab for normalcy. Her question might have been an effort to try to pull me back into that that female caretaking role that she spent her life trying to create in me, so that a man would want to marry me. And I don't know which it was. Nevertheless, for a moment, not for a moment did I have doubt that she loved and accepted me, and even through her chauvinistic perspective was challenged, even though her chauvinistic perspective was often challenged by my defiant activism and feminism throughout my life. And so that was my experience in coming out to my family and coming out to my sisters. The implications, though, that I came to realize was that coming out was important for the people that I worked with and for at the institution, at the college. So I did have the experience of a staff member coming to me at one point, and you have the open door and people can come in, and you have the president's hours. And a staff member came in, and for the life of me, I couldn't figure out what it was she was trying to talk to me about until she got teary-eyed and talked to me about how important it was that I had participated in an event with the LGBTQ student organization, and to have that kind of representation. And she talked to me, being a Middle Eastern woman, what it meant for her to be gay and not to be able to come out. And it was just really at that point that I realized, oh, this is me carrying, some different responsibilities, and I had not considered it. And I'm completely and had been socialized and had been raised to understand my role and responsibility, for an example, to represent the race as an African-American woman. That's what baby boomers are raised. That's how I was raised by my parents. I understood that if I didn't do well, that other African-American people behind me may not have the opportunity because, things are ascribed to a single individual for the whole race. I understood that, but it had not dawned on me to understand that in terms of my identity as queer. And so that was really, really an interesting experience. And it also was important for me to understand the leadership implications and what you bring and how you represent and the complexity of your intersecting identities and how they impact the way in which you show up as a leader, the way in which people experience you as a leader, the relationships that you have in your institution, and quite frankly, some of the power dynamics that exist, as a result of, the ways in which you walk in that intersecting identity. But I don't want to leave you mysterious. I'm going to close out with just letting you know what happened, because remember, I said I had to come out to my mother and my brothers and sisters, which, at no point I didn't have the teenage angst of worrying about getting kicked out of the house and whether they love me or not. Quite frankly, what people think about me is not my business. I was a woman in my own right that was completely comfortable in my skin and with loving who I loved. But I had my very religious grandmother. Now that was a whole different terrain to navigate. And I can't say that I really ever came out to her because, she was approaching her 80s when I started seeing my now wife. And I figured, well, there's no need to rock her world. So I chose not to tell her. Now, it wasn't that I was afraid to tell her. It was a courtesy on my part to her. I wasn't afraid. And so I'm going to read this little section. I wasn't afraid. To the contrary, I'm unapologetic about who I am and who I love. But I was willing to let her stay in her comfortable reality. The trouble is that it challenged my sense of honesty because she continued to be with us for a long time. So remember, I said that she was in her 80s. Well, then she turned 90. And then she turned 100. And then when she was finally 103, I'm like, now I'm living this 25-year-old lie. And so I finally talked to my wife. And, and the whole family was in on it. I would say to my ex-husband, please call Grandmother Vaughn and say hello because she mentioned you, But finally, I decided I was going to tell her. She was 103 years old. I actually planned a trip to Washington, D.C. to go visit her. And weeks before it was time for me to go, she fell and did not survive the complications from that. So I never really got to, quote unquote, come out to her. And while that may be, kind of this humorous, bittersweet story, I'm keenly aware that many have been in the struggle, paving the way for people like me so that I could have the luxury of making the kinds of decisions that I made and allowing those decisions to impact the ways in which I provided leadership in my case, in the California community colleges. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Regina. That was awesome. And I really appreciate the story about, going and looking at books and trying to figure everything out. When I was in that process, it was going to see Personal Best 100 times and Desert Hearts, which the lesbians on the line will know exactly what I'm talking about. So it was like, oh my God, we exist. So I totally appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, and our final speaker we're going to go to is Daniel Lopez. Talk to us, Daniel.
Yes, thank you, Erica. Well, first of all, I want to start by thanking Ray because, a couple of us already mentioned how he really kept us with this project. And so, Ray, thank you again. Thank you, Erica, for inviting me. I was asked to participate in this project a month into my presidency here at Herald Washington. And I was asked to do an article on diversity and inclusion, focusing on my student affairs experience. I had been vice president of student affairs for a number of years here in Illinois. By the way, I also used to live in Northern California. I missed the weather. So I'm jealous to all of you here from California. So I came into the project, I think at the very end, and I was really delighted that I was asked to come and participate. So my contribution was really focused on my student affairs experience and my work at the universities that I was at in regards to diversity and inclusion. And I will tell you that this project for me was very therapeutic. This was, I think, the first time for me that I really had the opportunity to look back at my career as a gay leader. I think, not that I, did not know, obviously I was gay. I've been open and for many years, but for some reason or another, I had never even thought about it. And I think as I reflected through the process, it was because I think I was very fortunate to work at institutions where I think they were a little ahead of the game with some institutions, especially when I hear about what happens in other states. But I was really fortunate to be at places where, not that they got everything right, because they did not. There was a lot of issues at all the institutions that I worked at, especially as I was moving up in higher ed. But I remembered that part of the reason I think these institutions were very much supportive of LGBT students, faculty, and staff was because of the student activism. And and obviously queer faculty and staff and allies who really made a lot of these things easier, at least. So I feel like I was privileged that I was able to take advantage of things that probably some of my predecessors did not, right? Some of you have been, I listened to Karen's story and read her stories, and it just, I'm so glad that that we had people like her and others who, and obviously Ray and others who really have done this work for so many times. So by the time I came around, I felt that we didn't have to fight as much. And so that I owe to all the work that has done before me. So I was able to really just focus on the kinds of projects and initiatives that would move an institution forward when it comes to supporting LGBT students, faculty, and staff. So I did, a number of projects, started a multicultural center, one of the institutions that I was at, created a resource for the LGBT community. We did our institutionalized pronouns, which I don't know if you remember, but that was a big deal when we were working on that and getting our institutions to buy into that idea. I think even today we still use them. So there were a number, I think, of initiatives and projects that I was able to participate in. And as I moved into more leadership roles as associate vice president and then vice president of student affairs, I was able to then continue with that work with all gender restrooms and lots of other kind of initiatives. So once again, for me, I just felt really fortunate that I was able to basically take advantage of all the work that had been done prior to me coming in. And the other thing I will say, we talked about intersectionalities here. As a Latino gay, immigrant, former undocumented student, all of these things really have made me the person that I am. And I think it's I love race, a word that you use, humanity, because I'm often in meetings and people just look at me wondering if am I the real thing, and I guess just this people are not used to being with leaders who truly are sincere and who are willing to take risk. And I think that has to do with my experiences and those different intersections that I mentioned. And so just to close, because I know we want to get to questions, for me, it's been a really therapeutic project. I was really delighted to have been asked to participate. And I just really feel very, very fortunate that I have now all these colleagues that I didn't know were there. I look to them and reach out to them often. So I hope that's something that we can continue to do. And, I always think about, I guess I've always been very aware of my Latino-ness, right? And I see obviously there's some really true, there's a lot of similarities between being an immigrant and a Latino in higher education and obviously an openly gay president now. And so I look forward to the questions. Let me turn it back to Erica. Thank you again for the invitation.
Great, thank you so much, Daniel. I just put a note in chat if anybody has questions to feel free to put them into chat. While we're waiting for folks, I am going to ask Karen and Regina, in my article, one of them, the article on feminism, I talked about the fact that in my career, I've experienced far more sexism than I have homophobia. And my article details like some of the things that people have said to me, not thinking how insulting they are. Like if I ever want to see, if I ever want to experiment and see if I'm just missing out on the real stuff, I've had male faculty actually offer their services to me in case I want to rediscover what being heterosexual is. That's fun. But I'm curious, Karen and Regina, what is your perspective? More sexism or more homophobia or a combination?
Well, it's a layer cake that gives in many ways. I mean, I think in terms of our different identities and which slice you're being served in every interaction, every email, every meeting. I mean, so I think I find, and others may have a more discerning perspective to your answer, it's just such an organic hot mess that sometimes I find it actually difficult to parse. And, although, my spidey senses are, yeah, I'm not being treated the way I ought to be being treated here. So, okay, what am I going to do about it? And after decades of that, I've got kind of a list of, again, to raise superpowers here that I have a hard time parsing. I don't know what I would do with the parse other than to say, well, are you being just, being an asshole because of my gender or because I'm queer? Let's get down to that. So I don't know that, but I do know it's a mix, and maybe even the person who's perpetrating that kind of behavior, they don't even know it. They don't know, but they do know that somehow I don't fit some notion they are comfortable with or expect.
Okay, great. Thank you. Regina, thoughts?
So yeah, well, when you asked me if I have to give you the direct answer of which is there more, sexism, or is it more about your gender or more about your identifying as queer, I would say that there's more racism in my experience. So part of the issue is that racism is intended to distract. So you could be distracted trying to figure out whether it's racism or sexism, those types of things. But whatever it is, it's the ways in which we are all socialized and where there's certain, depending on what's going on, there's certain permissions to disregard and disrespect, to dehumanize and disparage people because of whatever you might want to assign to them, because of their gender, or because of what because they don't fit the dominant framework, whatever that might be, whether it's the dominant, the centrality of whiteness, or whether it's the dominant framework of being male, or whether it is the hetero, normativity that exists throughout. And so the issue is not, from my perspective, the Olympics of what it is. The issue is, so what are the implications for you as a leader? Because you will need to be prepared that you will experience that you will get the types of things said to you, like the services that were offered to you. You will get those types of things, and those things are intended intentionally to distract and knock you off. And so you have to be careful not to take the bait and chase that rabbit down that hole. And in the meantime, the other things that require your leadership attention are being neglected because you're busy doing that. Now, it's funny that Karen mentioned coaching. I too am what they call a diversity executive coach, certified to do so through the Coaching Diversity Institute. And, one of the things that I did when I became president was the first thing I did was hire a coach, because I did not want to embarrass the board or the chancellor, because I was out there in the middle of the quad scrapping with some faculty member that got in my face, or some staff member that felt like they could say certain things. I'm like, yeah, I better go ahead and get a coach on this. That was the first thing I did.
Okay, that is a great comment. Nina, I want to comment on your bi erasure. I've never seen that. I've never seen that term before, and I think you're right. I think, as yes, Ray commented, we talk about LGBTQ, we talk about leaders, presidents. We don't really know that we have a T president yet, but we also have not done a good job of embracing the B as part of LGBTQ. And that is one of the things that we haven't done well as a community. That would be my perspective. So I have a question for Ray, because Ray, you also have, you wrote an article, what was it, 3 or 4 years ago, about being HIV positive. And can you talk a little bit about how that aspect of your identity has impacted your LGBTQ leadership or not, or what your experience has been around that?
Yeah, so I appreciate that cue up in that invitation, Erica. So in the intersectionality chapter in this book, I found myself surprised to be in it, because I didn't think that my intersexuality was the same type as others. And I put my hand up to talk about this, and the rest of the authors were like, yeah, you have to do it. Like, because I was wondering whether or not being a person living with HIV determined my leadership more than being queer. And it took me a while to take that apart, because actually it's as big in my life that I grew up in the 80s in New York City, during the HIV epidemic, as it is that I grew up being queer. And what I tumbled to was that this is an important intersectionality for me, that I probably wouldn't have been a president if I didn't grow up during the AIDS crisis. I mean, it led to a certain kind of energy. I mean, I learned to fight for my life in a way that a person that age doesn't usually have to. I buried partners, friends, learned to be an activist at an age when most people don't. And what was interesting to me to think about, like, which part is queer and which part is living with HIV. So some of it's duly determined, I think, for me. When I'm with my leadership trying to incorporate voices, that's me, like, doing the thing that we were talking about earlier about bringing in unheard voices. But it's also like, trying to pay attention to all those men at the time, my people, who died, who were lost. And then some of it starts off being queer and then being driven more by HIV, like the fabulousness thing, the creativity thing. I mean, I think that that starts, as I was talking about earlier, by being queer, but then like this whole idea of like fighting for your life and succeeding, against the odds, definitely is an aspect of my leadership. And then some things like, just going beyond my sense of responsibility to myself, to pay attention to all those who've died, and who we don't have. That's all HIV. So I think it makes me a better leader when I parse out like where things are coming from. I don't think I'm just being a psychologist about this. I am a psychologist, but I think it makes me, if I understand the roots of my leadership, it makes my leadership be stronger if I have a conversation with myself and with others about this.
Mm-hmm. And I think there is, it's just a shared experience, and it is a vulnerability that you have through your own experience, that there's no training in the world, there's no empathy in the world that takes the place of it. I think there's no other way to say that. And then, we only have a couple of minutes, but I want to just put it over to Daniel about your experience being both undocumented and out. And was there a conflict there? We have a Quest Center here at our college that has traditionally serviced both our LGBTQ and our undocumented population together. We're trying to build them out, so we're separating them. But can you just say just quickly kind of what that experience was like, having those two identities simultaneously?
Yes. Well, I think they're very kind of similar struggles, being undocumented and LGBT. So, as a matter of fact, I would just, once again, I've been really fortunate to have some really great mentors who helped me kind of navigate that in my own experience as a student and then as a professional. And then I had the opportunity to actually develop undocumented student resources based on the LGBT work. Like, for instance, one of the things that I've been doing here in Illinois is doing undocumented student and staff training model after our safe zone. And so I think that's a really great way of connecting that work, which is very, very similar, I think, in terms of how to approach it, in terms of getting people to understand and be advocates, right? Not only the students themselves, but also how do we provide the tools to our faculty and staff to be able to serve specific populations, in this case, undocumented students. And once again, model after the LGBT work that has been done.
Great. Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank our 4 panelists. I know Dr. Stanbeck Stroud had to, we thought we might lose her at some point because of being on a hotspot. We all know what that's like. And just thank you. Thank you for everything that you've shared. Thank you for participating in the webinar, Ray. Thank you so much for, answering the call when Johns Hopkins Press reached out and said, we really need this book. And we do, and we need to continue to tell our stories, because as I think everyone has kind of hinted at or even said directly, it is showing our humanity that is what counts as leaders, because you never know who is out there watching, wondering, what am I going to get to be in my life? And the more they see people like us getting to be our fabulous selves, our superhero selves, the better for them, because that's what matters. So again, thank you. Thank you to everyone who came from the caucuses. Even if you're not a member, please join our Women's Caucus, our LGBTQ caucus. We are here to help our students and help each other in serving the folks in California and nationwide. So again, thank you so much. Thank you to my panelists, and let's be safe out there.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Woohoo. Hey, PCC Zoom support, thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
Nice job. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I think it went well.
Yeah,
We
me
had
too.
40